Good afternoon, good morning, depending wherever you are. Slowly start as I see people are still joining the webinar. First of all, welcome to a new year of webinars from Consulting Werk. I'm going to start with today's webinar about OpenEdge client startup parameters. Don't worry, I'm not going through all of the hundreds of startup parameters which are there. My goal is more to focus on some of the concepts and how they can be used. I'll go into more details on some of the startup parameters. Generally, my intention is just to explain the concepts and how to use them and when and potentially also a little bit why. On the housekeeping, as with all of our webinars, we are recording this webinar. So please keep your cameras off. Otherwise, we'll have to edit them out of the recording. Thank you. In the next couple of days, we will be uploading this to YouTube, and our colleague Christina will email you then with a link to that and also with announcements for further webinars. Good. Well, then let me start with a short introduction. My name is Mike Fechner. I have founded Consulting Werk. I'm working as a director, I'm running the business, but I'm also working in technical roles. I support our customers as an architect in modernization projects, and I'm responsible for the development of our toolkits, our developer products like the Smart Component Library, the WinKit. Been using Progress now for 35 years, started with version 5. Along the time, specialized in various areas, and well, recently, it's probably also around about 20 years now, using object orientation language, software architectures, desktop user interfaces, app server, web technologies, all those kind of things. And with Consulting Werk, we are an independent IT consulting organization, but focusing really on OpenEdge and related technology. Related technology can be front-end technology like .NET or web technologies like Angular. Working with our team here from the office in Cologne, where I'm currently located, with colleagues working out of the UK, the United States, Romania, and Netherlands, and supporting customers in Europe, North America, Australia, and South Africa. We're providing developer tools and consulting services, different areas where I think we have a reputation as being the experts in the field, like GUI for .NET, using Angular with OpenEdge, software architecture, object orientation, etc. And that is those are skills that we generally use to support our customers during modernization projects. Simon, can you please turn off your camera? One of the tools that we've developed and that we are still maintaining, developing, and using very actively in our modernization projects is the Smart Component Library, a developer framework that has been built to support modernization projects for OpenEdge. We have a strong architecture foundation in the framework, a very strong backend. Our backend is also used in other developer frameworks as a foundation, such as Build1, for instance. We support the usage of data in the backend, either in a classic relational fashion. I think that's where OpenEdge has traditionally been strong. But we also have support for object relational constructs, which typically architects coming from other technologies into modernization projects expects to see. And so with the Smart Component, we can serve both demands. RESTful interfaces is a very strong feature in the framework. Many developers need to integrate with other applications, either for consuming RESTful interfaces or for providing them. We provide different UI options for the desktop using OpenEdge clients and primarily GUI for .NET web user interfaces or mobile interfaces. The Smart Component Library comes with an application framework that is part in the framework that requires data in a database to store authentication information, users, localization, menus, workflows, scheduler, etc. Quite a long list of features. I'm pretty sure that later this year we'll also be doing a webinar on features in the Smart Component Library again. And Smart Component Library has been built mainly to support modernization projects where typically there's an existing OpenEdge application that may be based on a framework or not. So the Smart Component Library has a lot of hooks where it can integrate with existing applications and frameworks. Yeah, before I start with the startup parameters, an urgent reminder, I think it cannot be repeated often enough. OpenEdge 11.7 will retire on the 1st of April this year, so that's 46 days from today. 6 weeks to go, roundabout. Later this year, Windows 10 will also retire, October 25th. And rumors say that around that time, there'll be a new version of Windows 12. I know that Microsoft once said that Windows 10 will be the last version of Windows, but apparently they're working on Windows 12 now. So what does it mean? After April 1st, we should not expect any security fixes for OpenEdge 11.7, and that in a world where security threats are increasing and the one more severe threat to business applications. There will not be bug fixes in OpenEdge 11.7 after April 1st. No new platform certification after April 1st. And I mean, that just means that as of today, you just cannot expect that OpenEdge 11.7 will still be running on Windows 12. It may not. It's, as of looking from today, it's pretty much like a lottery. So many of our customers are taking the date April 1st quite seriously. Some are really eager to be on OpenEdge 12 on April 1st. Others say, okay, well, within a couple of weeks after April 1st is still okay. But I think every serious user of an OpenEdge application should have a strategy for upgrading from 11.7 to either 12.2 or 12.8, which are the two long-term supported releases. 12.8 being supported for the next, I think, 6 years, 12.2 for the next 3 years, roundabout. More details for that in the progress documentation in the platform availability guide. Good. Well, then let's start talking about startup parameters, the topic of this webinar. Good. So the reason why I had the idea of doing a webinar or presentation on startup parameters is, I mean, we primarily work with developers. We also work with DBAs, but our focus is development and modernization and supporting developers. And rather often I meet developers and I ask them questions like, well, what's the setting of the startup parameter in your environment? And then they look at me, startup parameters, what do I have to do with startup parameters? Other developers are very experienced with startup parameters, know them in and out, probably better than myself. But there are developers which are challenged if you tell them, well, please, in a test environment, increase the logging level for a certain log entry type, or try whether a certain startup parameter increases the performance. And they look at you and say, ooh, these parameters, I'm afraid the environment that I use for development and testing has been set up by a colleague 10, 15, 20 years ago, and the settings have never been changed. And I think that's a big problem. Developers should be aware of startup parameters. Developers should be knowing how to configure their application as part of their development routine, and developers should be able to recommend startup parameters for the application side to administrators that roll out applications for users in production environments. So when we speak about OpenEdge clients, there are various types of clients. The main clients are the Progress GUI clients, ProWin or the ProWin32. So ProWin is the 64-bit Windows client, ProWin32 the 32-bit Windows clients. Both are there on 11.7, 12.2, and 12.8, even though I every now and then bump into developers that still believe in rumors that OpenEdge 12 does not support 32-bit Progress runtimes. That's complete nonsense. 32-bit Progress runtimes are well supported. And I personally am expecting them also to be there in OpenEdge 13. There's a web client, which is a thin client for Windows. The main difference between the thin client and the GUI client is the thin client is incapable of connecting with a database, and the thin client is incapable of compiling. Apart from that, both can do pretty much the same. And then there's the character client or the TTY client. Processes _progress, both on Windows and Unix or Linux available. On Unix systems, it's pretty common to use one of the wrapper shell scripts, Pro, MPro, BPro, MBPro. They all start the _progress with a handful of standard startup parameter added. I must say I never found a lot of favor in using MPro or Pro. I always use the _progress. And I see there's a type on the slide, it's progress with a single S. I'll fix that later. For the purpose of deciding which startup parameters is valid, the app server agent process is also considered a client. The app server also connects against the database. The app server can connect against another database. The app server is executing ABL code as the character client does or the GUI client does. So for the purpose of the startup parameters, the app server is also referred to as a client. And that's also quite important when looking into the documentation. There are client session startup parameters, and most of the client session startup parameters are equally valid for the client runtimes and the app server agent process. There's some differences in the way you set them for the app server, especially things like the logging or the startup procedures for the app server. They're not configured using actual parameters switches. They are configured using settings in the OpenEdge.properties file. Well, for those still on 11.7, it might be still the classic app server, and then it's a ubroker properties file. But in 6 weeks from now, nobody's going to talk about 11.7 anymore, I hope. Very few startup parameters apply both to the database server and the clients, like -t, -s, -h. Typically, the OpenEdge client products, if you provide them with a database startup parameter like -V, they're silently ignored. That's also sometimes leading to some confusion. Some developers or admins may think that -b or parameters like that are actually client startup parameters. They are not. They only apply to the database server. I'm not going to go into detail on database startup parameters. I know that Paul Koufallis from Rightstar is preparing a presentation on those. I know that he's going to give it, for instance, mid-May at the German Progress User Group meeting in Cologne. And I'm also expecting that he'll be having that presentation available at the PAC challenges in the fall this year. And well, as we all know, Whites is pretty good at distributing their webinars on the various social media. I'm also expecting to see that presentation popping up there sooner or later. Yeah, well, startup parameter, those who are using Progress for more than a couple of years probably remember the Pocket Progress, this little ring book with the language reference and the startup parameters. Nowadays, the Pocket Progress probably wouldn't fit into a Pocket anymore. There are quite a large number of parameters, and I'm going to quickly show you where to find them on the documentation website. So I usually, either when I know what parameter I'm looking for, I'm actually starting at Google, but when I'm just looking at the documentation to get started. I go to documentation.progress.com or www.progress.com/documentation, whatever. Scroll a bit further down. It's not fully to the end, but close to the end. There's OpenEdge. I go to the documentation home. Then I can be looking at the various OpenEdge releases there. I'm expecting that on April 1st, OpenEdge 11.7 will not have this prominent space anymore. So I go into OpenEdge 12.8. And then in the Getting Started section, we find the startup comment and parameter reference. This piece of the documentation, I mean, the content is updated with every release because there may be new versions, new startup parameters with every version. But structurally, it's the same. We have a section about the startup commands. They're not that many. Then the startup parameters, the startup parameter usage categories. And that's where we see the different type of parameters for the client. We have the client session parameters, client connection parameters. Client connection parameters is how a client connects to a database. Client session parameters are things like a startup parameter, whether we have batch modes, the assemblies parameter, etc., etc. These abbreviations, there's CS and CC, that is also being shown then in the actual details of the parameter, so that we see whether it is a parameter that actually there for the database server or data server parameter or whatever. When I go on the client session parameter, I see different categories here: performance related, parameters that restrict the capabilities of the product, so that allow you, for instance, to restrict a development license to the capabilities of a runtime client license. ABL parameters that are most of the ones which are relevant for configuring the application behavior. Internationalization, code pages, etc. Statistic parameters if you want to understand things about memory usage and the like, and specific Windows parameters. So if I want to know details about, or if I want to get an overview of the parameters, I click on the category and then I see them by alphabet. So those are all the ones which are configuring how the ABL runtime behaves. And I'm only getting a one-liner here to explain what the parameter is doing. If I want to get all the details, I go into the bottom and I have the startup parameter descriptions, either on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side, and that is quite a long list. And this list here is mixed by database server parameters, by client parameters, by data server parameters, etc. And if we click then on one, it's not just a random pick, then we see here the description that this is a client session parameter, and we see whether it is a parameter that takes values. This one does not. It's just a switch that's there or not there, and which product it is relevant for. And yeah, as I'm not going through all of the parameters in this session, I find it quite important for developers to get familiar with the documentation where to find the parameters. Yeah, so when we look at the parameters, just some basic facts and also a little bit of confusion about the semantics of them or the yeah, well, the naming of them. They're parameters that have that are a single letter, minus P, minus B, minus capital T. It's probably very common ones. They're multi-letter acronyms LKW, TMO. It's a lock wait timeout. -1 is the only numeric parameter, and then in more recent versions, they're fully spelled parameters like reusable objects. But be careful with the fully spelled parameters. Some of them are camel case, like reusable objects. Others are all lowercase, like read no lock, for instance. Yeah, parameter case sensitive. A minus capital T is not the same as a minus lowercase t. A minus capital B is not the same as a minus lowercase b, etc., etc. The last one's minus P is a client startup parameter. Minus capital P is a database connection parameter to provide a password to a database connection. So they have completely different meaning, whether they're uppercase or lowercase. You need to get used to that. You use them by appending them to the client executor when you start a session. So underscore progress minus B, ProWin. Some of them have a value, others do not have a value. The value can be numeric, can be alphanumeric. The value can be just a 0 and 1 to turn on or off a certain feature or behavior. Most of them can be used in any order. There are some exceptions. The WSS, it's a not very commonly used Windows parameter. WSS allows you to restrict the Windows client to run only one instance of the client. So if you want to have an application that only runs once, you could use minus WSS, and Progress recommends to use it as a first parameter, because when the client is started a second time and detects that there's already a session, it will stop the other one. And when the parameter is the first, then Progress says, okay, then it's avoiding extra work to be done before detecting that the clients are running. Minus WA, WPP, so that's kind of like a twin parameter. That must be the last parameter. Minus WA is a very specific Windows behavior. So the Windows single session is also specific Windows behavior. So some of the handling of some of these parameters is very specific in the Windows client. Most startup parameters can only be used once. You can use them multiple times, but the last one wins. So for instance, when you try to provide two startup procedures, like there in the bullet minus p nope.p and minus p start.p, the second one wins, the last one wins. Other startup parameters, for instance, like the minus pf, which references a parameter file, can be used multiple times, and then all of them are relevant. Other startup parameters that can be used multiple times are the database connection parameters. If you start a client and you want to connect to multiple databases, well, then you use minus db and the other database connection parameters as often as how many databases you want to connect to. Some startup parameters are outdated, and typically with outdated startup parameters, you can still use them, but they just don't have any effect. So they're just basically garbage or noise on the screen. I still see very often the minus capital N parameter with database connections, which tells it should be a TCP/IP connection. Since quite a long while, TCP/IP is the only database protocol. It's the only network protocol supported for database connections. There's actually no use in minus N anymore. Minus E is also a parameter that you see quite often that was replaced in version 7 by the MX parameter. So it is actually quite a good idea every now and then to review the startup parameters that you're using, whether they're still listed in the progress documentation, and if not, reconsider them or try to figure out whether that parameter really went away and should be replaced with something else. Some applications need quite a large number of parameters, and you could all append them to the executable. Have a long list of parameters and actually never understand or never be able to read that. Or you put them into a PF file. All the OpenEdge products, like the clients, the app server, and the database server, support the usage of PF files. Then you reference with the minus PF startup parameter the name of the PF file, either a relative file name in the same folders where you start the client, or in the subfolder, or with period slash whatever, or an absolute file. PF files can be referenced from within PF files, so you can nest them. The parameters which are within the PF file, and I'll have a sample on the next slide, they will actually be interpreted as if they would be in position of the PF file. So it's basically just like a replace in that position. The file extension of PF file is free. You could use any file extension you want. Recommendation is to stick with PF, that everybody knows what you're doing. Further recommendation is to use one parameter per line. It's not a must, but a recommendation. Because if you're not doing that, then I think the whole purpose of being able to make it better readable is gone. So this is an example of a PF file. You see a list of startup parameters, one line per parameter. If the parameter has a value, the value in the same line. You can have comments in lines with the hash sign. But I could also have it all in one line. You see in line 18, I'm referencing another PF file from within the PF file. The relative path reference is not relative to the PF file that contains the reference, it's relative to the client working directory. PF files make startup parameters reusable, better readable, you can use multiple PF files for a single session. It's also quite a good idea to use PF files for starting the database server and for connecting to databases, so that all the gathering of -db, -S, -h, and whatever parameters might be needed do not have to be provided for all of the clients. There's one special purpose PF file, the startup.pf file, that is always used. The startup PF file contains settings that you have chosen when you installed OpenEdge, or that somebody else has chosen for you when he or her installed OpenEdge for you, especially those settings for code pages, numeric formats, date formats, etc. You can add whatever you want in there as like the standard startup parameters for all of your OpenEdge clients. You can change them. So if you made a mistake in picking a wrong code page during your OpenEdge installation, or whether your default for the code page has changed, you started with using ISO Latin 1 as a code page, and later your default changed to UTF-8 or whatsoever. So you can just make changes in the startup PF file in the OpenEdge install parameter, and that means you don't have to reinstall OpenEdge when some of those settings change. So that is, for instance, my startup.pf file. You see the values there starting line 30. The lines above that are comments, which basically say, hey, you can change this and some of the meaning of the standard settings there. It is possible to change the startup PF file location and also file name. There is a pro startup setting. The pro startup setting is either being provided in an environment variable for the TTY clients, or in the startup section in the Progress INI file on the Windows registry. There must be a value there. So there's always going to be the one default PF file that's used, whether it's the startup PF file in the Progress install folder or anywhere else. If you do not want any settings there, you have to provide an empty file as the pro startup reference. If you want to use the pro startup environment variable to add settings, but still reference the ones in your DLC folder, you can reference using the -pf parameter, the startup PF in the Progress install folder to include those settings as well. So you can set, this is now the Windows character client, set pro startup to startup PF in the current folder. By the way, I'm using in many of these samples here the character client. There are actually two reasons for that. One is the character client, especially in batch mode, makes it easier to show the command line that I used and the output in one picture. With a GUI client, the command line would be in a command prompt and the output would be message box or whatever. It's always a bit harder to put together on slides. The second reason is that since round about a year, we are using more and more Visual Studio Code as a development environment, and it's very, very handy for all sort of ad hoc execution of Progress code, use the embedded terminal in Visual Studio Code with the Progress batch client in that way. So that's kind of like why I have switched also for myself from using GUI clients as a standard to TTY clients. And don't worry, I'm not giving up my passion for working on Windows. But the Windows character product of OpenEdge is actually quite nice for these things. So what we see here now is I've set the pro startup to period/startup.pf, and I'm starting a Progress session. We see that the output of this procedure, the procedure is actually just outputting the session colon startup parameter value, which makes it easy to read the startup parameters on Windows. And I think on the next slide I'll have the sample program. The unformatted output there is basically the way it gets out of the session startup parameter property. The formatted one is I'm just replacing the comma with a line break. And that just makes it very convenient to see in which order parameters are being passed and also that the PF files are being provided. If I set pro startup to a file that's not existing and start a session with that, I'm getting error message unable to open parameter file startup not existing.pf. So pro startup needs to be pointing to something which is valid. If you don't want to use a standard PF file like that, then you have to provide a reference to an empty file. Especially with PF files, it's common to use the ability to override startup parameters. So you can reference the startup parameter multiple times, like the startup procedure, log files, etc. Memory for temp table, other memory-related parameters. The last provided value is effective, and one use case for that is like having, as an application vendor, one standard PF file, which is a foundation for all your customers using that application. Then you might have a installation of site-specific file with overrides to that. If somebody is trying to debug an issue, you might be overriding values directly on the command line. Parameter overriding obviously only works with parameters which have a value, because you need to provide the parameter second time and provide a different value. This does not allow you to omit certain parameters. So if in one of the PF files that you're referencing, you're setting reread no log or no increment or -q, reread no log instructs the client that whenever you read a record, it's not coming out of the client record buffer. It's always ensuring that you're reading the most recent version of the record from the database server. No increment, I'll show that in a couple of slides. -q, quick access, I'll also have details about that in one of the next slides. So there's no way to unset these parameters once they're set, which sometimes is a pity. There are other of these feature switches which are provided with a value 0 or 1 to turn them on and off, and those then allow you, by providing a 0 later, to override a previous value of 1 to turn them on. Some feature switches that has, well, I'm remembering this particularly since the OpenEdge 11 releases. Progress has introduced certain changes in behavior of the runtime during service packs of a major release, and felt that it would not be appropriate to significantly change the behavior of the OpenEdge runtime in a service pack. Then some of these behavior changes need to be turned on with a startup parameter. So for instance, -IO everywhere 1 was one that was introduced in OpenEdge 11 to support especially also for GUI for .NET. So it was introduced first with a default value of 0, And in the next major version, the default value was changed to 1. So that was the next major version. This feature was actually introduced. The nasty thing with this is that these startup parameters are then not backwards compatible. So for instance, this object performance switch 01 is a feature introduced in 12.8.4. If you're using 12.8.3, you cannot use that. That's sometimes biting us for reasons for testing on different service specs. We do not always update all of our PCs immediately to the latest service spec, but then we share our PF files through version control, and then some of our colleagues may get runtime errors when starting clients because this parameter isn't there, and then you actually need to know that they had been introduced in a certain service spec released. So let's look about something nasty with parameters, startup parameter Scrabble. That is a valid command line. Underscore progress minus preload CLR catch stop LKW TMO reread no log assemblies T DB1 DB SH HZN Z no query errors D reusable objects YY W YY BTT and so on. And then with values 1 test.p 10 AVL assemblies CTEM CWork and so on. 4711 localhost 10 1910 1920 1950 1990 81 DMY. Can anybody tell me what my setting for minus YY is? Well, the Progress client can. So the way this has to be read, well, Progress looks from the beginning and recognizes preload CLR as a parameter that takes no value. Catch stop is a parameter that takes a value. Hey, Wim, could I ask you to turn off your camera? Then minus P takes a value test.p. LKW TMO takes a value 10. Assemblies takes that value. That is minus capital T. That is a database file name. That is another database parameter. That is a service of a database. That's the host name. That is minus H, the number of databases I can connect. That is now a trap. It looks like a possible startup parameter value for YY, but it's actually used here for capital D. Usable objects 1920, YY 1950. So my year offset, so the offset for 2-digit years is actually set to 1950. My BT, my temp table buffer is set to 1990. 8K block size for temp tables. IO everywhere is set to 1. And minus lowercase d, the date format is set to DMY. So that's, if you have something like that, then you know that one of your colleagues was really mad to you. Looks a little bit like rec access. Rec access and these startup parameters are job guarantee of the person who put it together. So session startup parameters comes handy here too. I have a little bit shorter version here on the screen. No, it's here, shorter version of the Scrabble. You see that when you output session startup parameters, again here I use replace to replace the comma with a line break, then you get them all nicely one under the other. Because of this chaining behavior or the possibility to change startup parameters, sometimes when you're using a startup parameter that's only available in a future version of OpenEdge, you get confusing error messages. So if you use OpenEdge 12.8.3 and you try to use this object performance 1 parameter that only was introduced in 12.8.4, you get the message, you have not supplied the parameter for argued minus capital O. And you would look at this and say, hey, I'm not even trying to use minus capital O. But that is because 12.8.3 doesn't know about this long startup parameter. So it's treating minus T as the save temp files parameter, minus H the number of databases, the I is the no crash protection, S is the stack size, and minus O would then be a parameter which, funny enough, is no longer part of the documentation. So must be an outdated parameter. It seems to be interpreting the parameters and looking whether they have a valid value, not in order as they're specified. So that must be something else. But if you see something like that, you have not supplied a parameter for argument O that may, or that very typically is caused by using a startup parameter, a long startup parameter, long by the number of letters, that has been introduced in a later version of OpenEdge, and later version includes service packs or updates. There is the possibility to use an unnamed or default parameter if you start underscore progress or provin with just one value without a minus. Then depending on the value of the parameter, it's interpreted either as a database or the minus param. So if you say underscore progress space sports2000.db, it's trying to connect to the sports2000 database. If you say underscore progress test.p, it's passing it as the minus param startup parameter, and the procedure editor will use the minus param startup parameter to open the file. So if I'm running underscore progress with a path to a database, and then test.p without minus db and minus p parameter, it's actually opening test.p in the editor and connecting the database. The purpose of that is probably simplification of Windows shell integration, or make it shorter for these ad hoc programs. I would never use this to really run an application. It's just for ad hoc code. So running code, I mean, the main reason of using the progress client is to run an application. You specify the program to execute through the minus p startup parameter. Minus p startup parameter, well, the last one wins. You don't have to set one. If you don't set one, it's trying to run the procedure editor underscore edit in sessions that allowed to compile. But otherwise, you would say underscore progress minus p, and then your startup.p. Whether you reference .p or not is yours. You can also say my startup.r. So the same rules for running a .p file or .w file or R code, etc. Apply as with the run statement. The different licenses of the client behave slightly different when the procedure is done. With the development license, after running your procedure, you will fall back into the procedure editor. A runtime only client will return to the operating system after running the client. So basically the OpenEdge session will end. If you use the minus RR startup parameter with development client, so you restrict it to the runtime client, it behaves the same way as with the runtime client. So you return to the operating system after running the procedure. App servers don't support the minus p parameter. There you set the startup procedures in OpenEdge.properties or in the ubroker properties file. One thing which is a limitation, and well, it is a limitation since 20 years, but it's not the end of the world. You can actually write very nice OO ABL, so object-oriented ABL applications, but you will never be able to write an application that only has OO code, because you always need at least the client startup procedure. If you try to run the R code of a class with the .r parameter, you get an error message saying, well, you cannot use an object or a class with a run statement, so you need to use a use statement. And yeah, really that's just a very long way to tell you, hey, I'm not able to run objects directly. I also need a single procedure. Then another way of running progress code, not applications for users typically, is batch mode. Batch mode restricts the progress client so that basically there's no user I/O there. Things like the pause statement are silently ignored. You can use batch mode with the character client, but also with the Windows clients. I think in most cases it makes just so much more sense to run batch mode with the character client and uh, a GUI client that would need output direction into a file. The GUI client would pop up this error message there. If there would be a message statement, the character client will by default write the message statement to the Windows console window, or if you do a file redirection into that log file. Batch clients are a little bit require a little bit less memory. So in theory, they should be a little bit faster. Limitation in execution of batch mode programs is, well, there's no event handling. They're not, well, event handling is very often used for Windows applications, interaction with the user. And that is not intended for batch clients. So event handling and especially also the wait for statement is limited to use the procedure complete, read response, and connect events. So those events of the network sockets and asynchronous app server procedures, or the developer events U1 to E10, which I don't think many people will be using. You can try to use wait for close of this procedure. Then the character client will error saying, well, this is not something I can wait for. There's no widget in the state that I can wait for. Interestingly, if you try to do a wait for close of this procedure with a pause 10 or whatever value of pause, that's just silently ignored. It doesn't raise an error, but it also doesn't wait for 10 seconds. Sometimes you need to pass parameters to your application that are interpreted by your own application code. The Progress clients, other than the app server, but the character client, the GUI client, they do not have a way to directly pass parameter values to the startup procedure. And for that purpose, Progress OpenEdge supports two startup parameters, which are really only for us, for the programmer. It's the -param and the -ICF param parameter. The latter one, ICF param, was introduced together with the Progress Dynamics framework. And the purpose there was to provide a dedicated parameter to provide configuration to the Dynamics framework. But it's actually the same as the param. If you want to know the value, use a session property, a property of the session system handle. You can have an unquoted value, but if you have special characters or spaces in the value that you want to pass, you could or should be quoting the value. Since OpenEdge 12 Progress Dynamics, the Dynamics framework is no longer supported. Funny enough, still in 12.8, the documentation of the -ICF param says you should not be using it because it might cause compatibility problems if you'll be using Dynamics in the future. I really hope that nobody considers to start using Dynamics in the future. There may be people that are still using Dynamics and people that are porting Dynamics for their own use from 11.7 to 12. That's fine. But if you haven't been using Dynamics so far, I'm pretty sure that you can safely use the -param and -ICF param so that you barely have two startup parameters that you can use for whatever you want. So you retrieve them from these two session properties. So you could use them because we have two parameters to separate application-specific settings and more framework-specific settings. Another thing that's a little bit bothering for developers, -param is used by the procedure editor to open a file. So if you run your startup procedure and end your startup procedure, and you had been using a -param for whatever configuration for you, the runtime will fall back into the procedure editor. The procedure editor will try to open the file referenced by your minus param value, and then you get this error message by the procedure editor. So it's actually a little bit more handy to use the session ICF parameter, because you're not going to have this interference with the procedure editor default behavior. Yeah, quoted value there. I've in this sample minus ICF param. This value is for me only with spaces and quotes. When you query session column ICF parameter to know the value, you get the unquoted value then as a result. So one use case could be that you start progress minus B ICF param, and in quotes you provide configuration log file equals my log file.log and input equals my input.txt. So you will need to think about one way to structure those, and what we see very often, and actually we use very often, is use these parameters to point to an XML or JSON file or a simple text file, or use comma delimited values with a name equals value, and pass them then within your startup procedure to gather that configuration. Good. Let's look a bit about some parameters that impact the performance of running code, and the simplest to use there is the -q startup parameter. When you repeatedly run the same procedure or repeatedly use the same class file in your code, every time you run that, the AVM, the progress runtime, will check on disk whether there's an updated version of the R code or an updated version of the .p file every time. And that just takes some time. Even though the R code may still be in memory, even though when for objects or persistent procedures, you actually still have an instance of that persistent procedure in memory or an instance of that object in memory, whenever you need a new one, it will look on disk whether there's something new. For developers, that's quite handy, because that very often means you don't have to restart the client application completely to test updated source code or R code. But since it comes with a performance penalty, it's probably not desired in production environments. So just some numbers there. So here I'm starting a .p file that does nothing else than 10,000 times starting an empty procedure. And we see that this on my laptop here with the -q startup parameter takes 16 milliseconds, and without the -q startup parameter it takes 406 milliseconds. And I was trying this 5 or 6 times, so the values have always been there. So we see that for running 10,000 .ps, minimalistic R codes actually have a 30 times performance penalty. And the longer your ProPass is, the bigger the impact will be, the bigger the difference will be, because it will need to look in more folders. If you're using network folders with your ProPass, I hope not, but then the impact will be even higher. And that is some change in thinking. OABL applications. In OABL, in object-oriented code, you try to avoid spaghetti coding. You try to be structured, have small specialized class files. So this impact of checking whether there's an updated R code or checking for the R code on disk will actually be happening more often. Very often when I recommend people to use the -q, then they say, oh, no, then we can't just drop an updated R code into our production environment. It will be picked up on the fly. And some users still have the old version loaded and will use that forever, and others will get the new one, and it's unpredictable. That is true. There's a way, and I don't know whether it's really officially documented, to flush the cache behind -q, and that is by assigning a value to the current language property setting. Current language is used to change the R code language. That's part of the Translation Manager. Translation Manager is still well supported in OpenEdge 12.8. The one piece of Translation Manager which is not there anymore is a visual translation bit. And if you change the kernel language or set anything to the kernel language, including the same value to itself, so kernel language equals kernel language, it will flush all the R code, and that is a controlled way to make sure that from there on you're using the most recent version of the R code. So now you just need to find a clever way to tell your clients at a controlled point in time to flush the R code and not check all the times for your R code. And related to that are startup parameters minus capital D and MX. So the OpenEdge runtime needs to keep a copy of R code in memory of the currently executed code. Well, I can only guess why, but assume that this is also needed to avoid issues that could happen if you're having a running persistent procedure in memory and suddenly the R code in disk is changed, that the running instance of that procedure or procedure anywhere in the stack, the implementation is actually changed while it's running. So that is memory that is allocated for managing R code, and there are startup parameters to control that. When you use these startup parameters to limit that memory, you may force the Progress client to dump R code into temp files, the RCD temp files, as an overflow. I think it's pretty obvious that if you load R code from disk for executing it, have it in memory for a short period of time, and then when that memory is full, dumping that R code to disk just to read it from the temp file very soon after, that's not going to help improving the performance. So that's why keeping an eye on these parameters is relevant. So one of them is a minus capital D startup parameter that controls the number of R code entries the OpenEdge session can reference. Each procedure that's executed in parallel or objects, documentation typically refers to procedures, but the way that OpenEdge manages objects and procedures is very similar, so that applies to objects in the same way. Each procedure executed in parallel requires an entry in the minus D. The default value is 1000. You can go as low as 5, and the maximum value there is 2 billion. It is a soft limit. So soft limit means that unless you prohibit it, when you hit that soft limit, the Progress client will increase it automatically. And here the documented strategy is it will always increase it to 1.5 times of the current value. When you try it with very low values, you will notice that the 1 times 5 point is actually rounded down, which is very uncommon. Ideally, you'll set it to the startup values that the application needs. And related to that is the MX startup parameter. That's the memory used for caching, for keeping R code in memory. It's expressed in kilobytes. When that's executed, then the R code is swapped into these RCD temp files. Default values is 3000K, so 3 megabytes. Maximum value is 65 megabytes. Minimum value is 1K. It's also a soft limit, so it's increasing automatically. So when you start an application, and here my test.p is running another .p is running another .p, so I'm actually running 7 procedures in a stack. So we're seeing here the warning messages that we see when a soft limit startup parameter is exceeded, and then it's increasing it. The purpose why OpenEdge tells us when these parameter increase is happening at runtime is it may take some extra time. And so it's very useful for a developer or somebody in charge of recommending values for these startup parameters to people that set up production systems is to have an understanding about what values you need and one way to know that is really increasing them as long until you're not seeing these values, these messages anymore. You can enforce a hard limit. So in this case, I'm setting the minus D parameter to 5, so I can reference 5 R codes in memory. I'm running test.p, which runs test 1, runs test 2, 3, 4. So after test 4, I can no longer start another procedure in the stack because I've set minus capital D to 5 and I've enforced it as a hard limit. Here I'm using the combination of no increment and hard limit. That actually doesn't make a sense. If you set hard limit, there cannot be any increase because increase only happens when the soft limits are in place. That will cause a stop condition. So that means that after outputting the error message at the bottom of the screen, the client will stop, will end. So now we have a very brief look at the session statistics parameters. There are a couple of ones. They're all starting with minus y. The minus y starter parameter collects the procedure access and usage statistics, and at the end of the session, it will write them to the client.mon file. YC allows you to use Control-C to write them. There's a show stats ABL statement, which allows you to programmatically dump those stats. But let's have a look at the output of this file. In the first 23 lines of that file, you see all the startup parameters, etc., that are passed there. But for understanding the usage of MX further down in the file, these lines are interesting. So that is from the output of running my test 1 or my test.r, which runs test 1, test 2, 3, 4, whatever. We see that it has loaded in line 38 8,272 bytes of R code from disk. So around about 8K. If I calculate the actual R file size on disk, that's a little bit higher, so around about 10-15% more. So there may be some bits in the R code which do not need to be loaded. I don't know whether it's the header or whatever. We see that since I limited my MX here to 4K, I believe, whatever, it was actually writing to the RCD files 5Ks, and it was also reading to the RCD files 3Ks here. So we see here the I/O activity done by not having enough memory for the R code, with a large ERP system over a day, that will potentially be a large value, and MX is then the way to reduce that. Similar feature for improving load times, especially of class-based objects, is the reusable objects parameter. The reusable objects parameter, it's not just about keeping the R code of the classes in memory, it's also basically keeping the memory structure around that that contains the properties and variables and temp tables in an object instance, so that when newing an object of a class where you previously deleted an object, reusable objects allows you to reuse that instance, basically just wipe out all the property values and have that instance in place quicker. The default value is 25, which is pretty low. When having big OOABL applications, I'm more aiming at values, 10,000 or even 100,000. And the maximum value is also 2 billion. You can turn it off completely by setting it to 0. I've made some benchmarks here. I have a very simple object that I'm newing and deleting 10,000 times. If I turn off reusable objects and I do not use -q, it takes around about half a second. If I use reusable objects without .q, I improve it by 20%. If I use -q but not reusable objects, it's 73 milliseconds, so 7 times faster than not using any of the features. And if I combine both features here with a small value of reusable objects, because I'm just looking at one object that I create and delete and create and delete in 10,000 times, then my program does that in 30 milliseconds. So that's, again, 2.5 times faster than just using -q alone. So we see a continuous improvement in the runtime. How much that improves will fully depend on the size of the objects, and I expect that when you have bigger objects, and especially objects with temp tables in them, that the increase will be even bigger. I'll quickly go through temp table related startup parameters. The temp table related startup parameters are covered in a presentation that I did last year or 2 years ago on mysteries of temp tables. Temp tables are really very similar to databases, and the DBI file, the temp file, that is basically the overflow for data in temp tables, is pretty similar to a database. It's organized in blocks, and temp tables are very, very fast when you keep them completely in memory. And for that, you need to increase the size of the temp table buffer using the -bt data parameter. BT can be set between 10, so there always needs to be a little bit, and 50,000. And like a database, you have a choice of block sizes between 1, 4, and 8K. And the memory that needs is basically the BT value multiplied by the block size multiplied by 1.1, so you add 10% on top of that. With those values, if you start a PassOE with 2 sessions, for instance, use BT10, so the smallest value, and 8K block size for the temp tables, and I start quite a lot of application in that session, then I can see that my PassOE agent starts and allocates 110 megabytes. If I bump up -BT to 50,000, then I see that my PassOE agent needs 9 times as much memory. So that's a lot of memory. If you use a lot of sessions in your PassOE, or you run a lot of clients on a terminal server, that is memory that the system needs to have available. But if the application is temp table heavy, then the temp table buffer is really one of the easiest way to tune your application runtime. Quickly go over that and look at some timings. So what I'm doing here is I'm reading 200,000 records from the database into a temp table, and then I do a for each. This for each is not indexed. This temp table there does not have an index on the name field. So it's doing a runtime on the fly sorting when I go through that. And we see that the 200,000 records need to be read from a database too, then put into the temp table, and then I go through that. That with this, I see that the runtime of a simple program varies based on the BT and temp table block size between 5.4 and 2.5 seconds in total. The populating of the temp table, that's taking the longest here. But if I look then at the unindexed for each through the temp table, then we see that actually based on the -BT, that is improving the runtime roundabout by 4 or 5 times. Yeah, so that is very easy to gain if you have the memory for that. Good. Let's look at some other settings. ProPass, the Progress character setting uses the ProPass from an environment variable. Windows typically uses INI files or the registries. Also, I must say that using the registry for configuring a Progress runtime, I find that not as convenient as using an INI file. The INI file, you can very easily just distribute that with your program code as it's just another file. Yeah, you can use the registry too. To control where the Windows client reads its configuration from, there are two startup parameters, the base key startup parameter and the ini name startup parameter. For whatever reasons, Progress does not support reading those startup parameters from a PF file, so they need to be added to the Provin command line directly. Typically what we see with the GUI clients is that we have two startup parameters. One is the -pf to point to the PF file, and then we have the base key ini, well, 3, and the ini name to point to the INI file. But still that keeps it rather short. Related to the ProPass is the base ADE startup parameter. The base ADE startup parameter, I don't know, it was, I think, introduced with one of the early OpenEdge 10 releases, so there since quite a while. That points to a directory name. And when that is provided, Progress adds all the PL files automatically to the ProPass, and that folder is also added to the ProPass. So if you're thinking about deploying a runtime application and you have a number of PL files for different modules or whatever, and a few R codes directly in that folder, instead of specifying the ProPass in an INI file or anywhere else, you could be using the -base ADE parameter. I mean, the ADE there, ADE, I mean, that's the naming for the application development environment, so App Builder, the data dictionary, and those set of tools, because that's what Progress uses it for in a development environment. In a development environment, it uses the base ADE startup parameter or the default value of the base ADE startup parameter to load all the PLLs from the DLC GUI or DLC TTY folder, but you can absolutely use it for your own folders, for your own PL files too. You can set it to empty string to basically disable the base ADE feature. And if you ever wondered why OpenEdge.net.pl is the only procedural library that Progress ships that you actively have to add to your ProPass of all your sessions, well, that is because the OpenEdge.net.pl is in a subfolder of DLC GUI or DLC TTY, and the base ADE parameter does not look into subfolders. For me, it looks a little bit like somebody at Progress wanted to start structuring the DLC GUI folder a little better and have PLs in subfolders, and didn't realize that that has impact on base ADE not using that PL or not locating it. But you could copy the OpenEdge.net PL in a folder with all your other PLs, point base ADE to that folder, and then OpenEdge.net PL will, like any other PL or APL. APL is the extension for the signed PLs that has been introduced in, I don't know, 12. whatever. Some of the innovator releases between 12.2 and 12.8 introduced a new additional form of procedural libraries, so-called APL. But OpenEdge.net PL is not different in any form. Then there's a -trick parameter, and trick is not a client startup parameter. Trick is a client connection parameter. So that means if you have different databases that you connect, each -db could be followed by a different -trick parameter, and that just points to the folder or the PL file that contains the trigger code for that database. When you're not using the minus trig, then the triggers for that database are searched in the ProPath. Yeah, DLC is also relevant for running progress, especially on Windows when DLC is not read from a environment variable, but from the registry on INI file. It is quite handy to use the undocumented startup parameter minus zdlc to override DLC. Zdlc was originally introduced for the web client, but it works nicely with the Provin or Provin32 executables too. When you use zdlc, the DLC value from the progress INI file is just ignored, and it is used from that startup parameter. Then what we use for clients or scripts or whatever way we want basically a self-configuration where DLC is located on Windows, you can use a Windows batch file to read values from the registry. It's an awful long line, and don't ask me to explain you what it does. But basically here we look in order for the DLC setting in the HK local machine software PC progress 12.8 startup. Because the Windows registry is organized that way, we look for 64-bit and 32-bit. And basically with this sequence, we have all the known progress versions to us. And the first one we find, we use, and then we run a certain utility without relying on a properly configured progress INI file on that machine. And I'm pretty sure that could be optimized a little bit. One form of optimizing would be deleting all the DLC versions that we expect nobody to use anymore, and maybe it's even possible to put that in a loop. So you can very nicely use Windows batch files to read from the Windows registry as well. And then we pass that into the progress client using the minus zdlc parameter. Other parameters which are also pointing to stuff that the progress client can execute are the .NET related startup parameters, minus assemblies, preload CLR, and CLR net core. The assemblies parameter points to the folder that contains the assemblies XML file and all reference assemblies which are not in the GAC. So the minimum requirement for the folder with the minus assemblies parameter is to have an assemblies XML file, which could be empty. So it could be an empty XML file. It needs to be a valid XML file. It needs to have the assemblies node as the root node. If that is not there, the progress runtime will throw an error when you're using minus assemblies to point to a folder that doesn't have that. The preload CLR startup parameter loads the .NET runtime and the assemblies referenced in the assemblies XML file at session startup. Otherwise, it happens at first use. If you do that at the session startup, it may increase the memory consumption. Somewhere in the documentation it's mentioned that it's actually a little bit faster than doing it at first use. It's definitely something for the user. When he's starting the application, he knows he's waiting for the application to be ready. If you use the .NET runtime or various .NET assemblies at first use, then the user may have an unexpected waiting whenever a new .NET assembly is loaded. Depends on what may look or may feel better to the user. If you use many custom assemblies, I mean, this is not a startup parameter directly, but it's related to the minus assemblies parameter. You can put an assemblies.config file into the folder that is referenced by minus assemblies with this structure. This is actually a config file of the .NET framework, so not necessarily something that Progress has introduced. And the probing private path there that references subfolders of the minus assemblies folders that contain assemblies. And that's just a way that we actually prefer when we're having quite a bunch of custom DLLs that we need to provide for the application, to organize them in subfolders and yeah, make it a little bit easier to navigate the folders. So then starting 11.7 and not 11.7, 12.7 and 12.8 Progress has added support for .NET Core. .NET Core is a new version of the .NET framework, or well, actually it's not .NET framework anymore, it's just .NET. One of the significant differences is that the .NET Core support is available on Linux 2 and 12.8. So you can use .NET Core on a Linux machine when you're on 12.8. When you turn on the -CLR.NET Core parameter, then Progress will not try to load the classic .NET framework, which is version 4.8 typically, or 4.8.1. It will default to .NET 6.0. Unfortunately, Microsoft does, since I think November last year, no longer support .NET 6.0. The .NET frameworks have a very short lifespan. Like each year there'll be a new one. I don't exactly know with which service pack Progress introduced then the support for .NET 8. It might be 12.8.3 or 4. You can change to 12.8 to .NET 8, but therefore you have to modify a file in the Progress installation folder. This progress.clrbridge.net core.runtimeconfig.json, and the line 3 and the line 6 where it says TFM for target framework, and line 6 version. If you change that from 6.0 to 8.0 and 6.0.0 to 8.0.0, then the Progress runtime will use the .NET framework, and I expect that, yeah, very soonish Progress will probably have to support .NET 10, and then we will have to change that file again there. There's a series, I don't know whether it's a complete list because they're undocumented. There's a series of undocumented startup parameters. Many of them are an open secret. I used the ZDLC before to point to a different DLC value on Windows. ZDS reuse is used together with reusable objects. The reusable objects feature didn't support objects with temp tables in 12.0 or 12.1, and when that feature was added, this feature switch was added too. ZN allows you to compile procedures that contain variable definitions or temp table definitions or buffer definitions with the underscore. Z no query exp errors. I'll have a sample for that on the slide, on the next slide, and something with related to deferred logging. So -ZN, if you try to compile a program that defines a variable called _test. So here I'm using the var statement syntax used in, I think, 12.4 or 12.5. But the same would apply to a defined variable _test as integer, unless you're using the -ZN startup parameter. You can't compile that. Same would be for temp tables or buffer definitions starting with the underscore. If you look into the source code of the data dictionary and the app builder, etc., probably everybody who's using the app builder has seen the error messages with _u buffer not on file or stuff like that. It's kind of like a namespace that Progress wanted to reserve for their own source code. Yeah, so if you want to either use variables starting with an underscore, or you want to be compiling the data dictionary source code because you want to make modifications to it, you need to be using the -ZN startup parameter. The -Z no query expression errors is quite new. I think this change in behavior was introduced in 12.8. Starting 12.8, the program below will throw a runtime error. So if you look, what's happening is I'm defining a temp table with an integer in the character field. I'm creating a record there. And then I do a find first customer where custom equals integer of a as a quoted string or name begins B. So integer of quoted string A raises a runtime error everywhere, but before 12.4, it does not raise a runtime error in a for each statement or in a, well, anyway, in a where phrase. It's silently ignored. It silently returns the unknown value as if you would be executing it with no error. That was considered a bug, and so Progress fixed it. And as you can believe, suddenly throwing a runtime error from where phrases can cause a serious change in behavior of applications. The -z no query expression errors startup parameter can be used to revert to the old behavior. My recommendation would be to plan in some time to fix your code, that you're not using expressions that potentially raise a runtime error in where phrases. But yes, I know everybody will now tell you, yeah, we have 50,000 source code files or even more. Going through them all to fix that will take us years. But you can start slowly and surely and maybe do a testing round whether it affects you or not. I personally believe that the behavior of raising the error, even in a where phrase, is better. I want to see the runtime error if there's an invalid type conversion, for instance, or if I'm referencing an invalid handle there, because it usually means that something else went wrong in the code before. But yeah, you can turn it off to avoid runtime issues. Yeah, well, I think those are the last set of slides. Logging related startup parameters, there are quite a few. Client log, log entry types, logging level, log threshold, num log files, so log threshold and num log files for log file rotation. Debug alert to include the stack trace into the log file. Client logging is for programmers a very valuable tool to know what's going on in your application. You can get details about dynamic queries that are executed in the session. You can see the stack trace, so one line for every procedure that you're executing, and so on and so on. But this is really typically one of those parameters that, depending on what issue you're looking for, you would be changing the the amount of logging that you do. And in the production environment, you definitely would not want to see a line in a client log file for every procedure that an app server executes. As a developer, that might be quite handy. So you need to be able to change that based on what you're looking for. So for the log entry types, I'm referring here to the documentation. Let me open that link. There we see there are various log entry types. For jail message writes every message statement and error messages to the client log file. For jail trace writes every procedure that you're executing, every object that you're executing. These log entry types, they have a logging level. At logging level 2 for jail trace, you just see one line whenever you execute a procedure. With logging level 3, you're also seeing a line when you're returning from a procedure. With logging level 4, you're also seeing the values of the input and output parameters. And the more you increase the logging level, the more data you see in the log file, the more valuable it can be for a programmer. But if you use that, for instance, on an app server for a full day, you're trying to use that to locate issues in a test environment used by many users, you'll have gigabytes of data easily. And you'll probably need a very clever way of analyzing that log file. I very often write then for jail code to look through that log file. to look for certain issues. And one thing that you also need to be aware that it creates large log files, so it may also have performance impact because it produces disk I/O. But if you, for instance, use 4GL trace with logging level 4, and you write all input parameters and output parameters to your code into the log file, that may include things like passwords. If you're passing a password from the login dialog into a procedure that validates the password, you would see the password in plain text in the log file. If you have queries that search for persons maybe based on their birth dates, you will have the birth date, which is considered personal information, in the client log file. So in a development environment with hopefully test data, not sensible data, that's okay. In a production environment, that can be a very serious threat for security. So be careful with using the client logging. So, and with this, I want to give a very quick outlook for this year, starting with conferences. Basically, the conferences, we see two periods of conferences. We see the spring of the local Progress User Group conferences, sometimes combined with the OpenEdge World Tour by Progress. So next month and mid-March, the UK and Ireland PAC is doing their meeting together with Progress on the 19th and 20th of March. Beginning of April, the Lithuanian Progress User Group in Vilnius. Mid-May, the German Progress User Group will have their meeting together with Progress Software on the 13th and 14th of May. The Baltic PAC is then a day later. So that will be quite a trek from Cologne to Tallinn on the evening of the 14th. The French PAC is having a meeting on the 3rd of June. I did not find out where, but it's on the 3rd of June. Currently in planning, so we do not have the exact dates, is a South African PAC challenge in Johannesburg and Cape Town. And then in the fall, we'll have the big PAC challenge conferences in Boston together with the OpenEdge World Tour on the 28th of September to the 1st of October, and a month later in Valencia in Spain, the PAC challenge from the 5th to the 7th of November. Last year at the European PAC challenge, we announced that this year the conference would be in Antwerp in Belgium, but for various reasons that plan has changed, and it's going to be in Valencia in Spain. And we have absolute certainty that despite the severe flooding in Valencia at the end of last year, it will be possible to hold the conference in Valencia next year. No, at the end of this year. So looking forward to seeing you all there. Well, Consulting Work is doing the next webinar on the April 3rd. Peter Judge will be teaching us some tips and tricks with VS Code, work smarter, code faster. Peter, if you're listening here, code faster is a promise, so stick to it. And yeah, with that, this webinar, like all our previous webinars, is being recorded. We'll be publishing it on our YouTube channel, so youtube.com/@consultingwerk. And yeah, you'll find this webinar there in a couple of days, and the previous ones are all uploaded there. And with that, Lutz, have there been any questions?
There was one question from Wim, which was answered by Rob, and the rest.
Thank you, Rob.
There are some comments about some of the parameters. One is about max, which I think he's commenting on it's close to 64 megabytes, the way it was shown in the presentation. And then there's one from Rob for the TMP-B size that also determines the temp table database records per block setting.
So is Wim now going binary? I thought Wim was always Mr. P. It looks like Wim is now also looking at the powers of 2. Wally asked a question about no EMEA pack, but I guess that was answered with the Valencia one. Because Spain is in Europe, and okay, Axel Ebner shared a dirty trick for preventing passwords in the client log file. If you put a character 13, if you basically prefix a password value with a character 13, then it will not show up in the client log file because line breaks in character values are not shown, or basically the first pattern. That's actually quite an interesting trick. Joseph Toss asking whether I recommend using UTF-8 rather than ISO as the code page. Generally, I would say in 2025, and with every business becoming more and more international, UTF-8 is a very is a recommended code page. The one limitation with UTF-8, and that's quite annoying, is the character client can only display characters of a single code page, or of a single byte code page. So you can have a UTF-8 database, but the character client needs to be ISO. They need to be careful. The character client would not be able to display characters coming out of the database from a different code page. So let's say we have Western European as our CP internal, but the database has some Eastern European values, or I don't know, Cyrillic values. The client would not be able to display them. So if the user would be updating that value, then yeah, those values would be converted to whatever garbage. But in web applications, so PassOE being the backend for web application or GUI applications, there's really no reason why you should not be using UTF-8. It's just the character client that has limitations there. Good. Good. Wim is doing more mathematics with P. If there's no further question, then I would say thank you for your time, and looking forward to seeing you soon, either at one of the conferences in our next webinar. And well, have a nice day.